Leaking pipes, leaking cash, and now parasites leaking into the water supply. Can anyone fix the water industry? The water companies were passed into the private sector debt-free. But with the public now revolting against the tide of effluent in our rivers and seas, will they now have to pick up the bill? Also tonight, the godfather of artificial intelligence, Geoffrey Hinton, has a warning for humanity.
My guess is in between 5 and 20 years from now, there's a probability of about a half that we'll have to confront the problem of them trying to take over.
And does that potentially leads to extinction level threats?
Potentially, yes.
And the new members of Generation Rent, the growing number of pensioners stuck in the private rental sector.
I expected that there would be consideration for when I was older. It seems that nobody cares. They just don't care anymore.
Good evening. Water should be a simple business. Everyone needs to buy it. The companies that provide it all have regional monopolies. The key raw material is free. It should be the easiest buck around. But between mismanagement and misregulation, something has gone badly wrong, as events this week have shown. Ben is here. Bad week.
It has been a bad week, Faisal, for the water industry. South West Water, which serves Devon, has been apologising today for the fact that a parasite has entered the local water network and made hundreds of people in the town of Brixham ill. And this has really been seen, understandably, as a failure of the first duty of a water company, which is to deliver water which is safe to drink. And it comes a few days after the BBC reported that United Utilities had released millions of litres of raw sewage into Lake Windermere in the Lake District back in February. And the context for both of these stories, Faisal, is claims of chronic underinvestment by water companies which had been privatised in maintaining their networks, which critics say is responsible for these kind of pollution events happening. It also comes, of course, in the context of a bigger debate about whether privatisation of water in England has fundamentally failed and is behind, partially at least, some of these problems. That was put to the Deputy Chief Executive of the association group Water UK this week in a parliamentary hearing.
When I speak to my colleagues in France or Germany, Germany has 66,000 overflows, which are broadly unmonitored. When I speak to my French colleagues, they cannot tell me how many overflows they've got. So I don't want us to think this is a uniquely English problem, because it just isn't. I take the point that it's an unusual ownership model. Most countries do not have the system that we do, but I think that's a separate issue to the question of environmental performance.
So, Faisal, I think many analysts would agree that privatisation doesn't necessarily mean that you have problems with pollution. But what critics say is that they look at all the dividends which have left the privatised English water system since 1989, £72 billion, and they say that surely can't have helped when it comes to the infrastructure deficit spending.
Well, thanks, Ben. We'll hear more from you in a moment. But I'm joined now by the Conservative MP, Anthony Mangnall, whose Totnes constituency includes Brixham, and in the studio here by Laura Reneka of Henley Mermaids, a group of women who came together through their love of open water swimming and who campaigns for clean waterways. Laura, thanks for joining us here. Just explain to us how things have changed over the past few years in terms of your open water swimming.
We've seen a massive decline in the water quality in the Thames where we swim. It's gone from clean and clear to having all the plant life having a sewage scum on it. It's very murky, very brown.
So visible, absolutely.
Visible. But that would be because sewage spills went up by 105% last year. 3.6 million hours of sewage dumped into the Thames. But also, the chemicals are the biggest problem. No inland waterways have a way of cleaning off the chemicals. 350,000 regulated chemicals go into our waterways through some form. And this is a massive problem.
And have you had to change the way that you kind of interact with the
Yes,
water?
I've been very poorly 4 times. And what we do now is we check the sewage map before we swim, and so that we are informed about where is best to swim and where isn't. And sometimes we have to go and swim in a lake that's clean or the swimming pool.
OK, well, let's bring in Anthony Magnall over in Totnes. Thanks for joining us, Anthony. What's the situation in Brixham tonight? It's pretty serious in terms of the number of people who've been impacted.
It's incredibly serious, and it's utterly contemptible how South West Water has behaved. I mean, this week started out with residents raising their concerns around the water that they were drinking from a taste point of view, and then a number of people stepped forward to reveal that they were quite seriously ill, some of which have, or one of which has recently had to go to hospital. South West Water then denied that this was anything to do with them, only for them to then say 24 hours later that it was to do with them because of what was in the water. I mean, it's been an utterly disastrous week for the water companies, and this is, this has got to be addressed.
And I think you're calling for an inquiry, aren't you? But it seems to be something to do maybe with the farm runoff. That's the suspect here, isn't it?
No, certainly not. Not as far as I'm concerned. I don't know that it's a farm runoff. It is an air vent that is supposedly being cracked or broken that has perhaps let a contaminated source into the water source. That's what's led to it. We don't know how that's come about. We're obviously waiting to hear how it comes about. Yes, I'm calling for inquiry, but all politicians call for inquiries. That's not good enough. The people of Brixham are rightly very, very angry, and they are let down, and they have this huge reservation, as we've just heard from your fellow guest tonight, about our water network and even our drinking water, and that is a totally unacceptable state.
Now, I mean, you've defended privatisation before, fairly recently. Is it a system problem rather than just a specific problem with an air vent in your constituency? Is it privatisation the problem?
So, I mean, on this issue, I just don't know, because I don't know what's caused that break in the system. I do make this point around privatisation, is that or nationalisation, if you go to a nationalised model, you're essentially putting all the costs back onto the taxpayer. Now, I think you have to have proper regulation to get us into this place where water companies are doing what they should be doing, which is upgrading our system, doing it in record time and not passing the costs on to the consumer. And unfortunately, that's what they're doing at the moment. So we need to make sure Ofwat's got the teeth to be able to do the things it needs to do. We need to be able to make sure that the Environment Act that we passed a few years ago actually implements those policies of stopping dividend payments, bonus payments, revoking licenses, sending executives to jail if they don't get these things right. Those measures are there. We have to use them. But tonight I'm sitting 3-4 miles outside of Brixham, concerned about a town that doesn't have access to water.
Yeah. Well, let me bring Laura back in. I mean, one of the solutions that we're hearing about is essentially there's not enough money in the system and that bills will have to go up. In order to provide for the cleanliness of the areas that you just told us about so vividly, do you accept that everyone's going to have to pay higher bills?
Well, basically, water is cheap. I mean, I pay £36 a month for my water. I think the point is that water is a shared resource, and every living thing on the planet has to have water to survive. It shouldn't be owned by foreign investors and run by mismanaged water companies. It should be run by a well-managed group of people who understand what's happening. They've made it complicated in order to make money, and that's the point.
But I did detect that maybe you did accept that paying a little bit more for the water
I think we do need to
as
pay
individuals.
More.
Oh, that's
I do think but we have already paid. That is part of the problem. We have already paid, and that money has been spent.
Well, let me put that back to Anthony Magnall. I mean, you're the politician here. I know you're representing your constituency today, but also you represent a party that's been in power for 14 years that maybe could have done more. Can you be honest with the public and say, actually, to deal with these problems, you're going to have to pay more, substantially more, potentially, for your water bill?
I mean, I think the interesting point about privatisation is that it's led to huge investment into the network. Yes, dividends have been paid out and bonuses have been paid out. And actually, I agree entirely with Laura. The mismanagement is staggering. Of course it is. This is why we're seeing these problems with overpaid executives across the country who are being performance-linked pay.
Not a single reservoir has been built in privatisation. Not a single reservoir.
And they've paid more in dividends than they've put back into the system, into the infrastructure.
This is exactly the point that I'm making, which is that when you look at the management is extremely poor. What we have to do is make sure that the regulator is working. We have to make sure that that investment of 100 billion that the world water companies have proposed between 25 and 2030 is expedited and delivered, and people can see the very realistic changes that are needed within our water network.
And bills, can I just ask you on bills quickly, Anthony? We've got to wrap up, but do you accept that bills are going to go up?
I mean, I do think water is cheap. I think we're going to have that conversation. But at the moment, while the water network is so poorly orchestrated, I don't think that cost should be passed back on to the British public.
Let's leave that there for now. Thank you very much, Anthony Magnell, and thank you very much, Laura Reniker. Thank you very much. Ben is back with us because it's actually not been a great week over the past few days, but the coming week could be quite critical.
Next week is really important. The Ofwat, the water regulator, is going to decide how much those water companies are going to be allowed to invest, and consequently how much they're going to be allowed to charge us for the water over the next 5 years. We expect a decision on the 12th of June, but we may get that a bit earlier, actually, maybe as soon as next week. The implications for Thames Water, this giant southeast water company which has been in real financial difficulties, are super.
For Laura's River.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Super important consequences of this meeting next week for that company, because if Thames Water doesn't see its own financial plans accepted by the regulator and its investors effectively walk away, that's how it could end up in a sort of temporary nationalisation, a special administration regime. Now, it's important to note that Thames is not the only water company in England and Wales which has financial stress. I think we can look at a chart here which shows that Thames Water there, 77% debt as a share of its total assets. But look, a lot of other companies also have high debt.
That was zero nationalisation.
That's right.
Sorry.
And you can see 3 other ones that have been identified by the water regulator as to watch there as well. SCS Water, Southern Water and South East Water. But there's some really important other context as well, Faisal, because Ofwat has indicated its target for maximum debt levels for the water companies will go down to that yellow dotted line, just 55%. So they're all above that at the moment. Getting back down to that will be financially painful. And this is important because some fear that if Thames does go into special administration, that could create a financial contagion effect that could affect other investors in other water companies in a similar way, and you could get the problem spreading. It's in the interest of investors, of course, to paint that dire picture so they get their plans accepted. But I think it is fair to say that the risk of financial problems for the water company as a whole, for the sector as a whole, is still increasing.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that next week. Thanks very much, Ben, for that. Now, the man many in the industry call the godfather of artificial intelligence is worried the technology is becoming too powerful for humanity's own good. Computer scientist Geoffrey Hinton quit his role at Google last year so he could speak freely about what he believes are some of the technology's dangers. We'll hear from him in a moment, but let's first recap where we are.
If you start thinking that humans are bad, then the natural conclusion is humans should die out. If AI gets programmed by the extinctionists, its utility function will be the extinction of humanity.
Elon Musk isn't renowned for his cautious approach to technology. If he's worried, perhaps we all should be. A recent survey suggested more than half of researchers give AI at least a 5% chance of causing extremely bad outcomes like human extinction. But others say those apocalyptic fears are overblown for headlines. This week, OpenAI launched their latest ChatGPT, and the worst it appeared to do was be a bit sarcastic.
Oh, that sounds just amazing. I'm so excited for this. Or whatever.
I'll be back.
But between Terminator and Alexa, there's a lot of middle ground to worry about. We have elections in both the UK and US this year, and AI bad actors are on the campaign trail. Will voters be deceived by fake news?
How is it you can't say one sentence during a speech without mumbling, but somehow you're blasting me with these big zingers?
That's a good question, prison boy.
New findings from the International Monetary Fund show that almost 40% of global employment is exposed to AI redundancy. As many as 8 million UK jobs are at risk in what's been dubbed a jobs apocalypse. So which careers are future-proofed? Actors and screenwriters have already been on the picket line, but almost every profession is vulnerable. Should your child be aspiring to a career in law or medicine or journalism,
I will work tirelessly to keep you informed as texts will be typed into my system, uninterrupted.
None of those sound like safe bets in the year 2050. Perhaps everyone should retrain as plumbers. And we need a few of those. Well, all this comes with another safety summit around AI in Seoul next week. And I began by asking Geoffrey Hinton whether he thought the world is getting to grips with this issue or if he's concerned as ever.
I'm still as concerned as I have been, but I'm very pleased that the world's beginning to take it seriously. So in particular, they're beginning to take the existential threat seriously, that these things will get smarter than us, and we have to worry about whether they'll want to take control away from us. That's something we should think seriously about, and people now take that seriously. A few years ago, they thought it was just science fiction.
And from your perspective, from having worked at the top of this, having developed some of the theories underpinning all of this explosion in AI that we're seeing, that existential threat is real.
Yes. So some people think these things don't really understand. They're very different from us. They're just using some statistical tricks. That's not the case. These big language models, for example, the early ones were developed as a theory of how the brain understands language. They're the best theory we've currently got of how the brain understands language. We don't understand either how they work or how the brain works in detail, but we think probably they work in fairly similar ways.
What is it that's triggered your concern?
It's been a combination of two things. So playing with the large chatbots, particularly one at Google before GPT-4, but also with GPT-4, they're clearly very competent. They clearly understand a lot. They have a lot more knowledge than any person. They're like a not very good expert at more or less everything. So that was one worry. And a second was coming to understand the way in which they're a superior form of intelligence, because you can make many copies of the same neural network. Each copy can look at a different bit of data, and then they can all share what they learned. So imagine if we had 10,000 people, they could all go off and do a degree in something, they could share what they learned efficiently, and then we'd have 10,000 degrees. We'd know a lot then. We can't share knowledge nearly as efficiently as different copies of the same neural network can.
Okay, so the key concern here is that it could exceed human intelligence, indeed the massive human intelligence.
Very few of the experts are in doubt about that. Almost everybody I know who's an expert on AI believes that they will exceed human intelligence. It's just a question of when.
And at that point, it's really quite difficult to control them.
Well, we don't know. We've never dealt with something like this before. There's a few experts, like my friend Yann LeCun, who think it'll be no problem. We'll give them the goals. It'll be no problem. They'll do what we say. Yeah. They'll be subservient to us. There's other experts who think absolutely they'll take control. Given this big spectrum of opinions, I think it's wise to be cautious. I think there's a chance they'll take control, and it's a significant chance. It's not like 1%, it's much more.
Could they not be contained in certain areas, I don't know, scientific research, but not, for example, the armed forces?
Maybe, but actually if you look at all the current legislation, including the European legislation, there's a little clause in all of it that says that none of this applies to military applications. Governments aren't willing to restrict their own uses of it for defence.
I mean, there's been some evidence, even in current conflicts, of the use of AI in generating thousands and thousands of targets.
Yes.
I mean, that's happened since you started warning about AI. Is that the sort of pathway that you're concerned about?
I mean, that's the thin end of the wedge. What I'm most concerned about is when these things can autonomously make the decision to kill people. So, robot soldiers.
Yeah.
And those are coming.
Drones and the like.
And it may be we can get something like Geneva Conventions to regulate them, but I don't think that's going to happen until after very nasty things have happened.
And there's an analogy here with the Manhattan Project and with Oppenheimer, which is if we restrain ourselves from military use in the G7 advanced democracies, what's going on in China, what's going on in Russia?
Yes, it has to be an international agreement. But if you look at chemical weapons, the international agreement for chemical weapons has worked quite well.
I mean, do you have any sense of whether the shackles are off in a place like Russia?
Well, Putin said some years ago that whoever controls AI controls the world. So I imagine they're working very hard. Fortunately, the West is probably well ahead of them in research. We're probably still slightly ahead of China, but China's putting more resources in. And so in terms of military uses of AI, I think there's going to be a race.
Sounds very theoretical, but, this argument, this thread of argument, if you follow it, you really are quite worried about extinction level events.
So we should distinguish these different risks. The risk of using AI for autonomous lethal weapons doesn't depend on AI being smarter than us. That's a quite separate risk from the risk that the AI itself will go rogue and try and take over. I'm worried about both things. The autonomous weapons is clearly going to come. Yeah. Whether AI goes rogue and tries to take over is something we may be able to control or we may not, we don't know. And so at this point, before it's more intelligent than us, we should be putting huge resources into seeing whether we are going to be able to control it.
What sort of society do you see evolving? Which jobs will still be here?
Yes, I'm very worried about AI taking over lots of mundane jobs, and that should be a good thing. It's going to lead to a big increase in productivity, which leads to a big increase in wealth, and if that wealth was equally distributed, that would be great, but it's not going to be. In the systems we live in, that wealth is going to go to the rich and not to the people whose jobs get lost, and that's going to be very bad for society, I believe. So it's going to increase the gap between rich and poor, which increases the chances of right-wing populists getting elected.
So to be clear, you think that the societal impacts from the changes in jobs could be so profound that we may need to rethink the politics of, I know, the benefit system, inequality,
yes.
Universal basic income?
Yes, I certainly believe in universal basic income. I don't think that's enough, though, because a lot of people get their self-respect from the job they do. And if you put everybody on universal basic income, that solves the problem of them starving and not being able to pay the rent, but it doesn't solve the self-respect problem.
So what, you just try to, the government needs to get, I mean, it's not how we do things in Britain, we tend to sort of stand back and let the economy decide the winners and losers.
Yes, actually I was consulted by people in Downing Street, and I advised them that universal basic income was a good idea.
And this is, I mean, you said 10 to 20% risk of them taking over.
Yes.
Are you more certain that this is going to have to be addressed in the next five years, the next Parliament perhaps? Next
My guess is in between 5 and 20 years from now, there's a probability of about a half that we'll have to confront the problem of them trying to take over.
Are you particularly impressed by the efforts of governments so far to try and rein this in?
I'm impressed by the fact that they're beginning to take it seriously. Yeah. I'm unimpressed by the fact that none of them is willing to regulate military uses. And I'm unimpressed by the fact that most of the regulations have no teeth.
Do you think that the tech companies are letting down their guard on safety because they need to be the winner in this race for AI?
I don't know about the tech companies in general. I know quite a lot about Google because I used to work there. Google was very concerned about these issues, and Google didn't release the big chatbots. It was concerned about its reputation if they told lies. But as soon as OpenAI went into business with Microsoft, and Microsoft put chatbots into Bing, Google had no choice. So I think the competition is going to cause these things to be developed rapidly. And the competition means that they won't put enough effort into safety.
Parents, talk to their children, give them advice on the future of the economy, what jobs they should do, what degrees that they should do. It seems like the world's being thrown up in the air by the yes. world that you're describing. What would you advise somebody to study now, to kind of surf this wave?
I don't know, because it's clear that a lot of mid-level intellectual jobs are going to disappear. And if you ask which jobs are safe, my best bet about a job that's safe is plumbing, because these things aren't yet very good at physical manipulation. That'll probably be the last thing they're very good at. And so I think plumbing is safe for quite a long time.
Driving, that's
not driving, no. Driving, but no, that's hopeless. That's been slower than we expected. Journalism might last a little bit longer, but I think these things are going to be pretty good journalists quite soon. And probably quite good interviewers too.
Okay, well, heaven forbid. Now, the image of renters is often one of people in their 20s and 30s saving up for a deposit to buy their own home. But as the population ages, there's a growing cohort of older renters who will struggle to afford their rent as they retire and their income falls. It is a trend that represents a social and potentially a financial challenge to society. Yasmin Arakan travelled to Cornwall to find out more.
I love the beaches. I love walking the dog on the beach. I like the history of it. The whole feel of Cornwall, it's in my blood, and I love living here.
Chris May is 69, an RAF veteran and pensioner who still works to help pay the rent on his small room in Newquay, where he lives with his dog Ori.
It's a nightmare. When I was under eviction notice, the closest I ever came on the social housing list for any property was 30. Normally I'm about 150 on the list. I'm lucky enough to have found a place that I can stay with my dog, but it's temporary. But it's also counted against me on the council. I have to start at square one again. And they're thinking, why? I have lived here all my life, except for my service in the RAF.
Cornwall has an older than average population, but it's not just here that the housing market is changing. Since the turn of the millennium, the growth in home ownership has stalled. The age at which people can afford to buy for the first time has risen, and the number of English households living in private rented accommodation has grown by a fifth over a decade. But the number of households over the age of 55 renting privately has increased much more rapidly, up by 71% over the same time. Morgan Vine is head of policy at the London-based charity Independent Age, who have been compiling research on what they call the hidden renters over the age of 65.
We've got a lot of people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who are getting to later life and they don't own a property, they don't have a full state pension, they're living hand to mouth. So it's really, really important that people in that situation get all the support they can. So many people assume that everybody past state pension age is living mortgage-free with high savings going on luxury cruises. We know that's not true. There are 2 million older people living in poverty across the UK, and renters are often a completely hidden group. The people that we speak to who call the Independent Age helpline, the renters, tell us that they feel completely invisible, not seen, and like it's thought that they don't even exist.
I'm worried because I've got a cat and it's his silly old woman stuff, but he's very important to me. He's my companion. And, you know, one of my worries is what would become of him. You know, I wouldn't want to go to a place where I'd have to lose him.
74-year-old Susan Curtis has been served with notice on the private rented flat she's lived in Romford for 12 years. Even though she's in receipt of housing benefit, it won't cover another flat in the private sector. So she now has to appeal to the local council for temporary accommodation until something more permanent can be found.
My landlady has applied for a possession order, which will then bring bailiffs, and it's not until that point that the local council will actually provide me with temporary accommodation or a hostel or maybe, you know, a permanent place.
Does the idea of going into temporary accommodation scare you?
Yes, it does.
Do you feel like you're being listened to? Do you feel like that you're being heard at all?
No, I feel isolated, and I feel sort of unworthy of any real care because it's just not there.
Do you think that's because of your age?
Yes.
Alistair Young is the chief executive of a housing association in Cornwall. He thinks the growth in the number of older renters in the private sector should concern us all.
It's expensive for us as a country as well, because with that expensive rent, particularly as they get to pension age, it's actually housing benefit that ends up soaking up the impact of that. It's from roughly £6 billion a year, and over the next 10 to 20 years it's forecast that the number of people in retirement age living in private rented will double. So it's a looming issue, an absolute ticking time bomb, and we really need a sensible long-term strategy from government to get to grips with it.
The growing number of private renters beyond normal retirement age is a challenge for future governments, as they are forced to pick up those housing costs. But it also represents a personal challenge for an increasing number of older people who are faced with limited options and an ever-present uncertainty.
I expected that there would be consideration for when I was older, for older people in general. But it's not. We seem to be left out of everything. And it seems that nobody cares. They just don't care anymore.
Well, that's all from us for tonight. No time for the papers, I'm afraid. Kirsty's here on Monday. Till then, have a great weekend. Good night.